I've asked a dear friend of mine, Richard Campbell, to get on stage and tell a little story. So we're going to call it story time, and we're going to pass out some ducks and some balls.
That's my friend Clark Sell. Big hand for Clark Sell. This crazy thing would not exist without him. This is his vision. I am in awe of you, sir. I am always amazed at how awesome this show is and how much fun it is. I am going to tell a story, and it's going to be family appropriate. I promise. Yeah, because that's how it usually works out for me. And if you went to my talk today, you know I started with this slide, this 1977 slide, because in 1977, I was 10 years old. Are there 10-year-olds out there? Where are the hands? Anybody who's 10? There's a few 10s. So that was the first time I wrote any code. I wrote it on a TRS-80 Model 1. Not the same kind of computer you see today, but that was what was around in 1977. But I also got online back then. But online wasn't the same back then. We had different hardware. Now, for those of you that are confused, that thing on the right is a telephone. And you used to have to dial it to call your friends. And you could call a computer with that telephone, and then you take the handset and you put it into the acoustic coupler, and you are now talking to another computer. Now, I was young. I was maybe 12 or 13 when I was doing this, and I couldn't afford a computer, but I had one of these. This is a Deck Writer 3 that I got at an auction for about $200. And everything was printed on paper. We used the wide carriage line paper. Is this familiar to anybody? This great paper. And so literally, instead of a screen, you had paper. And this is how I would play games online. We'd play Hunt the Wumpus. Now, the nice thing about that paper is you could use it through 4 times. You'd print on one side, then you turn it over, and you print it on the other side, then you flip it over, print on the back side, then turn it over, use it again. Don't waste paper. We also had a Star Trek game. That's what Star Trek looked like in the early 1980s. That little asterisk with the braces around it, it's not the That Conference logo, that's my spaceship. It took imagination to play video games back then, printed on paper, and you couldn't play at night because it printed on paper loudly. So let's fast forward a little bit to 1984. Now I'm a teenager, and the computers are a little more advanced. The modems look like this. This is a Micro Modem 2. It was 300 baud, which meant it would put out a whole about 30 characters a second. There's a little cable connector on the left side there because this is before RJ11 was a standard. So your phone jack varied from place to place. And the computer du jour at the time was the Apple II. Woo! 64K of RAM, and now we have disk drives. So we have a 5.25-inch floppy that'll hold a whole 160K of data. And if you were cheap, you'd clip the other corner and use both sides. See, today storage is cheap. We don't think about storage as a big deal. We have SSDs and hard drives and terabytes of storage, but back then, 160K was all you got on your floppy disk. And if you wanted more storage, well, hard drives were rare. And this is where my story really starts. So as a teenager, I had a bunch of teenage friends, and we acquired a hard drive that looked sort of like this. This is an IBM 2801. Now, the way we got this drive was my friend Steve was working in an office building and spotted one of these drives sitting in a corner disused with all the service manuals sitting on top of it. And he said, "What are you doing with that old hard drive?" And they said, "You want it? You can have it if you can get it out of here." All we had to do was move a 400-pound hard drive. This hard drive was 20 megabytes of storage. Now, in the era of the 106K floppy, the 20 megabyte hard drive owner is a god. And the good news is Steve had the car for the job. He had a 1969 Gran Torino that you can actually put a 400-pound hard drive in the back of. And with the help of a couple of friends, we took that hard drive back to his parents' place. He had the attic set up. He was running his own BBS on an Apple II. The BBS was called Twilight Zone. And he was going to add this hard drive. So a few things you learn about owning a 400-pound hard drive. One is, position carefully, it will crack the ceiling. The second is, don't leave it on. It consumes $200 a month in electricity. Guess how we learned about that one? So Steve was able to wire the drive up to his Apple II through a serial connection, and now we had 20 megabytes of storage, and we needed to fill that drive. And so we proceeded to pirate every piece of software we could lay our hands on. My favorite, Choplifter, the best game ever. We had the largest collection of ASCII porn known to man. And for anyone who doesn't understand what that means, ask your father. And then the accident. There was this lamp. We had named the hard drive Goliath. We named the lamp David. See, Steve had built a power supply for Goliath because it took 220 volts, and we didn't have 220 volts in the attic. So we built our own power supply through 2 different circuits, and we combined them together to provide enough power for Goliath to operate. And then this lamp fell over to that power supply, and it shorted 110 AC volts into the 5-volt supply, which is where the bacon picture comes in. It burnt holes through circuit boards. It fried that drive. And Steve called me and said, you better come over right now. And I drove my motorcycle over and I walked into that attic space and I walked in and smelled that sort of resinous, smoky, the smell of electronic death. And Steve explained what had happened with David and then said, we can fix it. No, it can't. No, man, we can fix it. Now, this drive was from the 1970s, and it's now like 1986. And he says, I have a source for the parts. Now, the electronics of the day were mostly, today it's CMOS. CMOS is the modern way. That's your laptops, all those computers. But before CMOS was TTL. Do you remember TTL? Transistor logic? This was DTL. This was diode transistor logic. This is a generation before that, and they just didn't make those parts anymore. But Steve knew that all the old arcade machines used DTL. And if we would just go dumpster diving at the arcade repair shops, we could acquire the parts. And for the next 6 months, we went in teams of 2, one of us in the dumpster with a pair of gloves, because there's not just electronic parts in that dumpster, and a clipboard full of part numbers. And you just read off the part numbers. 55C03, yes. All right, if you got one of those, take that part out. Take it back to Steve's place, we test it, we add it to the pile, and slowly Steve begins to repair the drive. Because at this point, he had rewritten the encoder on Goliath to store 50 megabytes of data, and we wanted all that gaming back. And finally came the point where everything checked out. It was all ready to test. We powered up Goliath for the first time in 6 months. And it spun up to speed, and the head stroked across the length of the disc, smashed into the backstop, the head snapped off the ends of the arm, started pinging around inside of the chassis like popcorn, and I turned off the drive. Dude, head crash, big time. And you're just not coming back from heads snapped off the drive arms. What do we do now, Batman? And Steve says, we got the bugger. So we start disassembling Goliath. The first thing to come out of Goliath is the disc caddy. 5 18-inch platters covered in aluminum oxide and ASCII porn. We took them apart. We called them the world's most dangerous frisbees. You can throw them, just don't catch them. I embedded one in a tree. Steve continues hauling apart the drive, but I'm not working on that anymore. I'm on the phone. I'm calling everybody that's ever used his BBS to let them know Goliath is never coming back. And it turns into a wake for a hard drive. I remember with Goliath, it was just a 20 megabyte serial connection. After a while, I look over and Steve is in the chassis of Goliath. Feet off the ground, butt in the air, in the drive. He's pulled out the main spindle, which was the full length of the drive, must have weighed 100 pounds by itself. But right at the bottom of the drive were 2 of the largest magnets we'd ever seen. But I didn't realize it at first. He just came up with this massive object and turned around and dropped it. And it shattered. And bits of magnet went sailing all over the room, sticking to everything metal. We found fragments of magnet for years, stuck to the heating vent, to the door hinges, to the underside of the bed, little fragments of magnet. But at the time I just said, dude, what was that? And he said, it's the biggest magnet you've ever seen. There's another one. You have to help me. So the two of us lever this big magnet out of the chassis, and we get a little too close to Twilight Zone. That old CRT green screen monitor, and the monitor goes, and it's now a 1/4-inch wide display, and it'll never get any wider ever again. Remember when you used to take a magnetic tip screwdriver and sort of swirl the electrons around? Big time version of that. Just bent that monitor. And Steve says, we gotta go to an arcade. We decide not to go to an arcade. Instead, we carry the magnet down back to his car, and it catches the side of the car. I can't get it off of the car. We get a scissor jack, and we put it between the magnet and the car, and we crank it. We dent the car, but we pop the magnet off the car. And we wrap it in a big green towel. And it's sitting on my lap, and my legs are numb. And I'm wondering if I'll ever have children. And we go to Bob's place, and I don't know why we went to Bob's place, but we went to Bob's place, and Bob had a 2GS. And I walked into his office, and I didn't even see his machine. I just saw the screen go. And Bob said, what's in the towel? And that's where we realized that teenagers are not qualified to own magnets this large. And we abandoned that magnet in the basement of Steve's parents' place. And as teenagers do, we forgot all about it. And life moved on, and his parents sold the house. And his father tells a story that the later owners of the house said they put a TV in the parlor, and the screen always goes so weird. And that's the story of Goliath. Have a great rest of your evening. Enjoy the water park. I'm sure there's a little more food. Get your last desserts, and we'll see you over there.